When Christians educate, we are accused of indoctrination. But when the world educates, Christians accuse it of indoctrination. Well, who's right? Is all education simply a power struggle between ideology? And what even is ideology compared to education? We will answer this question and paint a picture of Christian education in today's episode of the Richard Eng Podcast. Thanks for joining us. Well, I am glad to be back. I got away. My sister got married over last weekend, and I'm excited to be able to be back at church, and I was refreshed and enjoyed that time away. So important. And I feel like I was just talking with my next-gen pastor, Pastor Zach, and I said to him, I got to go podcast. I've got this burning in my soul, and he gave me a hard time for it. Someone shouldn't be that excited to podcast. But I honestly, I've been so encouraged by people who have been telling me, sharing feedback, and it's been encouraging to hear how this podcast has been a blessing to people, challenging them, equipping them, and to think more faithfully and critically from a biblical worldview. I want this podcast to bring clarity in a confused culture, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk more about the culture, and something that I want to be very clear on is when I do these podcasts, I don't want it to be like this chasing of fads and reacting to whatever's happening in the news today. I don't want to be that. And there's a place for that. There's other people who do that. They do great at that. But I want to get to more of the underlying currents that shape culture that maybe we're not even aware of, that has more power than we realize. And it was C.S. Lewis who said it's not the most dangerous ideas are not the ones that are visible and out there. It's the ones that are assumed and nobody thinks critically of. And that's my paraphrase, but that's the idea, is that we need to be careful and pay attention to the trends, the things that we assume, the things that we take for granted, and ask the question, is this even biblical? Is this even something that comes from a Christian worldview? Or is this something that's worldly that we are taking for granted and we're not thinking critically about? So today we come to the question, what even is education? And what's ideology? Right? Everyone's accusing the other, especially in this cultural war we find ourselves in the West, of indoctrination. You're indoctrinating, well, Christians are indoctrinating, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, that's not getting us anywhere. So we need to have a more fundamental conversation. So when we think about education and ideology, here's some definitions that I pulled. This is from Lexico. It's a dictionary that I found online. And this is what it defines education as: the process of receiving or giving systematic instruction, especially at a school or university. And I found this definition of ideology from the Cambridge Dictionary. And this says, a particular set of ideas and beliefs, especially one on which a political system, party, or organization is based. Okay, now this is important to note. Both education and ideology emphasize systematic instruction. So their distinction in our cultural moment might appear to be semantics. Like, what if it's both systematic instruction, then what's the difference? But they're not semantics. The differences are not semantics, because here's why. And this is going to be my definition. I am not seeing this other places. Maybe it is, and I'm just not aware. But I want to put forth a thesis and then think about it with you. Education is reality-oriented, and ideology is narrative-oriented. Education is reality-oriented. Ideology is narrative-oriented. So education happens when someone, by the process of systematic instruction, is grounded in reality. They, by virtue of the education, embrace the good, the true, and the beautiful as revealed to us through various fields of study. But ideology bases itself in narrative, which does not consider all the facts. Rather, the facts that support the narrative are emphasized, and the facts that go against the narrative are dismissed. Now, one could argue that education doesn't, or maybe perhaps cannot consider all of the facts. But I'm not saying that a proper education has to consider everything there is to know. But a proper education, when one is confronted by something that perhaps they didn't know before, they're open to learning and receiving and discussing the information that perhaps was not otherwise known beforehand. Whereas somebody who's an ideologue, they filter it through their narrative first before any truth claim or what have you, if it corresponds to reality. That's not important. The important thing for an ideologue is whether or not it supports the narrative. So the key question is this: which system of belief is true? And it's this system of belief then that should be systematically instructed. If we want actual education, then the question is not just what do we want to teach or whatever. We need to ask the question, what is true? Because if education is grounding its students or its recipients in reality, then you have to have an understanding of what reality is. This system of belief should be systematically instructed. So here's a better way of maybe framing this. Ideology bends reality around a story. Education bends the student towards reality. So an education that's good, true, and beautiful must consider two relevant components: nature and environment. So first we have nature, what it means to be human. All systems of education assumes a definition of what it means to be human. If an educational philosophy does not consider what a human actually is, this leads to ideology. For example, if we are made by God with a design plan, then to teach that human nature is malleable and could be changed based on my psychological sense of self, that is a false belief that should be rejected. But if God, the Christian God, for example, does not exist and human beings are malleable, my nature is whatever I want it to be, that what some philosophers have called the psychological man, that if my personal sense of well-being and identity and whatnot says I am this, then that makes me that. I don't have a nature because I don't have a designer, right? I just have random biological coincidence over the course of human evolution. If that's true, then what we see in our world today, where there's education being put forward in the public schools or on social media or in just various areas of life, then that isn't false. That's actually true education. You see why it all comes down to what's true. What kind of world do we live in? Do we live in a godless world where we make ourselves? Or do we live in a world where God made us, right? And the kind of world that we live in, that's what should push and shape and fuel what it means to educate. Because we need to educate and bend the student toward reality, not bend reality around a story. So first is nature, second is environment, how to function in our context in which education is taking place. So all systems of education make assumptions about the nature of our context, of what it means to be in a society, of what it means to have people together. As an educational philosophy, if it does not consider culture, then it leads to ideology. And so modern approaches to education assume that there is no standard of goodness, truth, and beauty. And I hinted at this before, but I want to dig a bit deeper into this. When you assume that there's no standard of goodness, truth, and beauty, this results in several key important things. Here's the first one. The belief that humans are malleable. Now, C.S. Lewis, he chided modern educational theory because it assumed that any statements of truth, goodness, and beauty were nothing more than statements of one's own feelings. So you see this in the book, The Abolition of Man, where C.S. Lewis, he's referring to some public education curriculum that he nicknames or codenames the Green Book. And he says this: firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. Meaning, if I say that something is beautiful, I'm not saying that something outside of myself has a quality of beauty. To the subjectivist, or to the one that believes that there's no objective morality, there's no objective good, there's no objective truth, I'm only describing my own feelings that I receive when I encounter something that I would feel is beautiful. This is why you see modern art, they don't talk about the art. They talk about what they're feeling when they're looking at something. That is a progressive, postmodern way of thinking about the world. There's nothing real on the outside. There's only my own subjective feelings. I feel this when I see that. What a terrible way of looking at art. This is a modern invention. This is a derailment of what has happened over the last several thousands of years. You see the great art leading up to just, a century ago? And that is gone by and large because we've bought the lie that there's no objective good. That art ought to, for example, align itself to something that is objectively real, right? Instead of just something that makes people feel certain things. If there is no objective standard of truth, goodness, or beauty, then there is no chief end of man by which all humanity is judged. Therefore, any human choice is, you could say, quote, good if it gives a person a positive emotion. So if humanity has no maker or design, then humanity is its own maker. Their own maker. If there are no objective standards, there cannot be a, quote, goal. This means ideologies such as expressive individual, or this leads to, rather, ideologies such as expressive individualism and psychological man. This is what Charles Taylor says. The understanding of life which emerges with the romantic expressivism of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own, as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. And Carl Trueman, in his book, and this is quite the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and there's a simplified version of it, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It is a staple to understanding what our world is going through. He says this: if education is to allow the individual simply to be himself, unhindered by awkward pressure to conform to any greater reality, then the individual is king. He can be whatever he wants to be, and rejecting the notion of any external authority or meaning to which education is to conform, the individual simply makes himself the creator of any meaning that there might be. If there is no objective good, if there's no objective truth, if there's no objective beauty, we make ourselves. And if that's true, if that's the world that we belong to, then education should teach you make yourself. You make your own purpose. You make your own identity. You make your own being. This is your job to come up with. And so education ends up being in a weird predicament where if you tell somebody to figure it out on your own, you're kind of imposing your worldview on them. It is a self-defeating claim, but I got a little ahead of myself. Second, if there is no objective truth, goodness or beauty, then the belief that culture, there is a downstream effect that what arises from that lack of objective truth is that the belief that culture can reach utopia. So if humanity has no nature, then all that stands in the way is outdated social institutions that has kept humanity held back or oppressed. Do you hear this kind of language in our world today? That the institutions need to be torn down. That we need to move on from religion, move on, be unhindered from Christianity. That's because if humanity doesn't have a nature, we make ourselves, and anyone who says otherwise is oppressing you. This is the pure nature view of politics, the belief that human beings are inherently good and can be perfected under the right conditions. And so Jeff Myers makes this observation. He, president of Summit in Manitou Springs, I went there. I had the life-changing being there in 2010 and set me on a course. I had good training before that, but that was just like the catalyst, this 2-week worldview training in Manitou Springs. And understanding so much of our politics today assumes the idea that if society would get its act together, there wouldn't be sin. There wouldn't be suffering. There wouldn't be poverty. You see the way that certain people in politics talk about problems. There is nothing attributed to human nature. It is attributed to systems of oppression. That assumes you get rid of the systems of oppression, humanity can flourish. The only reason that people make bad decisions is not because they make bad decisions on their own. It's not because they are in the place that they're in because they have responsibility. They don't have responsibility. It is the systems that oppress. You see why I started today with saying, I want to talk about the underlying currents. Because it's like weeds. You pull one up and another one pops up. And it's like, man, you get beneath the surface and you get to the root of the issue. This goes back to guys like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, who believed that if humans were corrupted, it was the fault of nurture, not nature. Like this stuff, you think, what's the point of studying philosophy and these guys that are dead? Because their ideas are shaping our world way more than you know. The fastest way to tear down institutions is to indoctrinate young people. And I pulled this definition from Lexico. Indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. I don't know if I agree with that definition. I think that you just have to get people to accept your narrative. And they might even think that they are being critical about it. But I just think to indoctrinate somebody, and I'm using this in the negative sense. I think there's actually a positive sense of the word indoctrination. You could say that to teach Christian doctrine is to indoctrinate. I'm just imparting the doctrine of the faith, right? But I think that the way that we use the word indoctrination is overwhelming in the negative sense. So I think it's useful to accept the negative sense and use it as such so that we don't create confusion. And so in that sense, to indoctrinate somebody is to get somebody to accept a narrative critically or not. Freeing young minds from outdated assumptions about the world, usually ideas stemming from capitalism and Christianity, allows humanity to take the next step of evolution, a society free of corruption. This is the goal. This is what we're working toward, right? Somebody who would call themselves say, progressive. What are we progressing towards? That's a good question to ask. We're progressing beyond Christianity. That's what it is. And I am Facebook friends with progressive Christians. I keep my ear to the ground on what's going on in their conversations. They are not Christians, not in any meaningful or historical sense. I don't think that they are Christians in even a mere Christian sense. They're certainly not evangelical like me. That's okay. I can be friends with non-evangelicals. That's fine. But to reject core, essential doctrines like the inerrancy of Scripture, like the virgin birth, like the historicity of the Old Testament, like stuff like that. It's like at a certain point, why not just call it your own new thing? Because you're rejecting what the Bible's teaching. Progressing beyond Christianity. Because it's Christianity that is making people oppressed. If you read guys like Karl Marx, this is clear. This is out there. You read these French philosophers, you read these guys that have been dead for 200 years, they're all telling you what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a free society away from Christianity. And then you reach utopia. There will be no more sin. There will be no more suffering. That's the idea. Well, we tried that in the 20th century. And guess what happened? Millions of people died. Ideas have consequences. And number 3, another consequence. Education based on these, I'll say based on these, not a third consequence. Education based on these 2 assumptions leads to raising revolutionaries. So G.K. Chesterton prophetically compared the conservative to the progressive. He said the progressive sees a fence on an old road and says, let us tear this down. The conservative says, let us first find out why it was put up. Now, what I see is people who call themselves progressive, they believe that the eradication of corruption comes from tearing down institutions, definitions, and norms. They are attempting to use the education system to bring up children to the point of moral buy-in. Now, what do I mean by moral buy-in? I'm borrowing this from Natasha Crane. She wrote a book called Faithfully Different, and she talks about how you think about moral buy-in likened to marketing. And so she walks through 4 steps. Desire, interest, awareness, purchase. That's marketing. You want to create a desire, you create interest, there's more awareness, and eventually the purchase. Well, moral buy-in, if you can get people to start celebrating something that the Bible calls sin, if you can normalize in the culture, eventually if you redefine what the Bible calls sin, let's say, you create moral buy-in. It is June 2nd. It is Pride Month. The Bible calls pride sin. And I am a old-fashioned guy for saying that. But it's like, wait a minute, time out. You're asking me to celebrate, to normalize, to redefine, to buy into a non-biblical definition of human sexuality. No. See, when we redefine the good, the true, and the beautiful, we are not educating. We are raising ideologues. We are raising revolutionaries who just want to tear everything down to reach utopia. There isn't utopia. The only human flourishing that can exist is when you live in accordance with the truth. And if Christianity is true, which I believe it is, and by good evidence, then how we flourish is by subjecting or submitting ourselves to the truth. Now, I'm not making a political claim. I'm not saying that we need to legislate and make everybody a Christian. On some level, I don't think that that's possible. Although I do think that nations flourish when you at least embrace a natural law perspective, which I think the founders did. You know, freedom of religion, you let people choose what they're going to believe in, right? you actually don't get freedom of religion from any other worldview. It's so fascinating. You look at the other nations in the world, you don't get freedom of speech. You don't get freedom of association. You don't get these things except from the Christian worldview. So the progressives want to saw off the branch that they're sitting on. But true education is in accordance with reality. And this is where we get to Christian education. Lewis argued that if Christianity is true, then understanding this truth fundamentally shapes how one lives. Knowledge of such facts necessarily alters one's actions. And he said this in an essay in God in the Dock. This principle extended directly to education. While both Christians and non-Christians might prioritize education, the kinds of education they pursued would be fundamentally different because their underlying beliefs about human nature and destiny diverge. If Christianity is false, then Christian education is ideological formation from a false account of reality. But if Christianity is true, then Christian education is not indoctrination into fantasy. It's formation into reality. Into reality. Now, before I go on, and I want to underscore this point, I actually wanted to cover a lot more, but I'm looking at my time and I see that I'm already at 25 minutes. And so I'm going to call an audible a little bit live and spend some time thinking about the rest of what I have, and then we'll probably spend the next episode covering what I was going to cover in the second part of this. But before we do that, I want to get into trivia. So here's our trivia question for today. What Old Testament book gives parents this command? You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall teach them diligently to your children. What Old Testament book gives parents this command? Stick around to the end to find out. Before we do that, I want to talk about the North Dakota Bible Conference. When we think about, I've talked about this the last couple weeks, last couple episodes. Uh-oh, did I lose myself? There we go. It's happening in September 25th through the 27th at Bethel Church in Devil's Lake, here where I pastor. This year's theme is designed, and we're helping Christians think clearly and biblically about what it means to be made in the image of God in a confused age. This is why I'm talking about what we're talking about today, because the Bible conference will actually educate towards reality. How do we embrace ourselves as being made in God's image, as being designed by Him? We derive our purpose, our identity, our meaning, our destiny, all the big questions in life, because we embrace that we are made, not that we are self-made. One of our featured speakers is Amy Davison of Mama Bear Apologetics, and Amy has a gift for helping parents and Christians recognize the ideas shaping our culture, responding with truth, grace, and confidence. And if you've ever wondered how to disciple your kids, answer hard questions, stand firm without being harsh, Amy is going to be incredibly helpful. She is like the best kept secret. My wife, some of you may know, works for Mama Bear Apologetics as their speaking coordinator. And there was an event not long ago, maybe it was about a year ago now, where Amy gave a breakout session to ministry leaders and pastors at a conference. And after that event, my wife got a flood of requests for Amy because she did such a good job. And all these pastors are like, we got to get her to church. We got to get her. So Amy Davison, she's going to be at the conference. And if you want to learn more, you can go to bethelfree.com/NDBC. That's bethelfree.com/NDBC. And we're even going to have a kids program nearby so that the whole family can come. So come join us for the North Dakota Bible Conference on September 25th through the 27th this year for the theme Designed. Now, if Christianity is false, going back to this, then Christian education is ideological formation into a false account of reality. But if Christianity is true, then Christian education is not indoctrination into fantasy, it is formation into reality. See, this is what the Christian worldview teaches. God made the world. Human beings are made in his image. Sin has disordered us. It's disordered our longings. It's disordered our sense of self. It's disordered our passions. It's disordered everything. It broke us. Truth, goodness, and beauty are objective and grounded in God's nature. Christ redeems by faith what sin has marred. And this world is meaningful because it is created and sustained and ruled by God. And eventually, God will remake the heavens and the earth. Now, all of these core teachings are not escaping reality. It's learning to see reality truly. So Christian education does not mean that we need to know everything exhaustively, right? Only God does. Only God knows everything. But Christianity does give us a true and coherent and comprehensive framework for understanding reality. And this requires both the right material and incarnation. I talked about the incarnational emphasis of education in the first podcast. But more broadly, Lewis situated education within the church's overarching mission. And so this is what he talked about. The church exists to draw people into Christ and to transform them into what he called little Christs. Little Christs. And any institutional activity, including education, that fails to serve this transformative purpose becomes wasteful. If our goal is to form little Christs, then anything that we do that does not accomplish that is just busy work. Yet Lewis rejected the notion that formal curricula or administrative restructuring could accomplish this alone. The actual character of education flows from the teachers themselves. A spiritually mature educator naturally transmits the sweetness and strength and spiritual health, while spiritually impoverished teachers communicates hate, jealousy, and suspicion, he goes on to say, regardless of official policy. And this is because you cannot impart what you don't possess. That's not a phrase from me. I don't even know where it came from, but you cannot impart what you don't possess. If you have a shallow faith and you're trying to teach, you are going to be imparting shallow faith. It's just how it works. You know, when Jesus said, follow me, he didn't just say, follow me in what he taught. He meant follow him in the way he lived, his character, who he is. And so Lewis emphasized that Christian principles applied to education must come from Christian teachers themselves, not just like authorities issuing directives. Christian education, in his view, was ultimately about forming Christians' minds and their hearts. People whose understanding of reality aligned with Christian truth and whose actions reflected that alignment. The purpose was neither merely intellectual nor institutional, but deeply spiritual, shaping individuals who grasp the eternal significance of human beings to live accordingly. Lewis talked about in The Abolition of Man the idea that we raise up people and we educate them, and we only find traitors in our midst. Meaning, you can teach people the right information, but if you neglect what he called the chest, that moral intuition, that sense of rightness that might mediate between the animalistic instincts of the belly and the sentimental or the mind, right? If you do not have character, then it doesn't matter what you think. The belly wins. The appetites that we have as sinful beings wins. You need to have strength of character. And when you don't, when you just train the mind and you don't shape the appetites, you don't teach someone to put to death what is therefore sinful in me, the flesh, to crucify the flesh. When you don't teach that aspect, you're just teaching people how to be smarter with how they sin. John Stonestreet, the president of the Chuck Colson Center of Worldview, he talked about how modern education, and this is not location specific, this is everywhere now. That modern education, when it doesn't teach people how to be virtuous, instead of people who are trying to, he used the illustration, this was long ago. Instead of people just trying to steal off of a train and you educate them, you're just teaching them how to steal from the whole rail this time. You're just making smarter robbers. And it's because education must be the whole self, all of life. When we educate, we are orienting people towards reality, towards what is true, towards what is good, towards what is beautiful. And this is not ideology. This is not indoctrination in the way that we use the word. If Christianity is true, which I believe it is, then to educate according to Scripture is to give the only proper education. And so let's pursue this together. This is why we must educate, because we are shaping people according to what is true and what is real. All right, let's end our day with trivia. What Old Testament book gives parents this command? You shall teach them diligently to your children. If your answer was Deuteronomy, then you are correct. Specifically, Deuteronomy 6:7. So this verse is a reminder that Christian education is not just a church program. It begins first and foremost with parents, forming children in the truth of God's word. I hope that you enjoyed. This is the Richard Eng Podcast. If you did, leave a 5-star review on Apple. I see several already have. Follow this podcast, share this podcast, help me get the word out. I'd appreciate that a lot, and I hope that this is a blessing to you. This is Richard Eng, bringing biblical clarity in a confused age. We'll see you next time.